or the idea of sacredness when he discusses, for example, the idea of abortion, and even when he compared this with the value of nature in his book on abortion, and also McIntyre, and also many natural lawyers, including your husband. So I'd like to know how do you locate your own ideas with these other authors. So.
Okay. Wonderful. These are all great. Commodification. Why put commodification aside? Where am I? Okay. Well, partly because in a previous paper I did more arguing directly with my law and economics friends. So part of the reason in this paper I'm putting it aside is because I've already written a paper that spends a lot of time on the essential thesis that economists would make if they were thoroughly principled utilitarians, to the effect that the problem is simply sort of market failures, right? If we could solve all of the market failures that plague capitalism, if we could appropriately price all aspects of nature so that, and if those prices were included in the prices of products, so that, you know, this product, right, the price of this product reflected the drying down on the groundwater and the toxicity of the, you know, manufacturing of the plastics and the transportation that caused it to, you know, move 1,300 miles before it got to this podium, and so on and so forth. If this just included all of its costs, all of its environmental costs, because no market failure caused there to be any externalities, well then we could just use capitalism and we'd get precisely the proper balance between environmental use and environmental conservation, right? That's the going claim. And so that's what environmental economists devote their life to doing, is pricing things that don't have market prices, using subsidies and taxes, ideally, as ways of getting products to reflect the proper prices, and then everything, when properly priced, will transfer hands in ways that will be preference maximizing. And what else is there if you're a good utilitarian? So my last paper spent some time on these claims, and so part of the reason I'm setting aside commodification here is for that reason. And I haven't sort of independently worked out a theory of those things that it's appropriate to price even if you price them properly, and those things that it's not appropriate to price even if you price them properly. But I know we think there are some things, at least most people think there are some things. Most people are really squeamish about, you know, a market for human organs, right? Organ markets or baby selling. I mean, we all tend to hit things where we just think, geez, we don't want a market in babies even if we're not underpricing babies, right? So, it's another paper. It's like future generations, right? Okay. Daniel, I'm probably not going to do right by your questions. They're deep, and I think I'd actually have to ask you a bit more about them. Let me take the second one first and just tell you I'm a realist. I got no problem saying that obligations exist even if there isn't anybody, even if there were no humans, there'd be a sense in which it would be true that animals shouldn't be tortured. So I'm a realist, and therefore I'm not going to sort of back off of claims of objectivity of that sort. Of course, it sounds odd to say that the Grand Canyon would have value if nobody was around to value it. I'd actually be happy to bite that bullet. But part of the reason it sounds odd is because so much of the value of the Grand Canyon lies in its aesthetic experience. So we're back to thinking, well, you know, even if moral rights and duties, even if moral truths don't depend on moral reasoners, aesthetic experiences may well, right? I think I'm going to have to talk to you afterwards about your first question about sort of the role that we could extract of moral emotions like shame and guilt And the gap between those emotions and responsibility, I certainly agree that the virtuous person experiences non-moral guilt and probably non-moral shame. And that's, of course, part of what I'm trying to extract at the end of the paper from a virtue theory, is the notion that we ought to do things to protect the environment that the environment doesn't have rights to, because we've exhausted rights, and that we have a hard time incorporating into economic models of a utilitarian sort. So it's precisely your intuition that there are moral emotions that define the virtuous person that don't correlate with deontic judgments of responsibility that I'm trying to extract when I run a virtue theory. And Ronaldo, finally, you are absolutely right that we should just throw out the language of a stew. Because a stew suggests, that you get the, right? It's like my brother, he picks out the meat. It's like everybody who gets the jar of nuts and they pick out all the cashews. Or when Michael and I were teaching theories of legal interpretation to judges down in Mississippi, and Michael got done going through a menu of theories of interpretation, 10 different theories of interpretation, all of which were inconsistent with one another, right? So you had to pick. The point was, you couldn't. So Judge Billy Bob was the Supreme Court of Mississippi. Chancellor of the Supreme Court. Chancellor in equity.
Not law.
So Judge Billy Bob puts up his hand and he says, Professor Moore, that's a really useful list, I gotta tell you. I really like that list, and I gotta tell you, I use every single one of those, because when I want to do this, and this one works, I pick that one. And when I want to do that, and that works, I just pick that one. At which point, one of the Supreme Court justices in the room yelled out, "Yeah, and that's, Billy Bob, why we reverse you so often." So, instead of calling it a stew, what we ought to call it is an archipelago, right? Namely, there are islands on which only rights judgments are the appropriate things to be debating about. And there are islands on which judgments are rightly made on the basis of what will maximize utility and preference satisfaction. I think on all islands you ought to be worried about your soul. You ought to be worried about the nature of your character. So maybe, virtue theory is the water that surrounds the islands or something. But we don't want to put too much weight on the metaphors. But it is true. We don't want to be suggesting that somehow morality has all of these components and we just choose which one gets us the result we want, because that's just to belie a kind of naked and simplistic and crude form of utilitarianism. I'm not calling on you. I've got another question now. But I probably can't answer your last question. On nature having intrinsic value and how to locate claims about intrinsic value in the larger literature about intrinsic value and what gives rise to it or how you justify it, and certainly how it relates to adjacent notions like the notion of the sacred. You love Dworkin a little bit more than me. I love that Dworkin, yet again, comes up with another term for the same thing, right? The sacred, the intrinsically valuable. Okay, actually, the sacred has its own special connotations, particularly for those who trace value within a theological ethics, right? I don't do that, because I'm as much an atheist as I am a moral realist. Go sort that one out. So I'm not getting any mileage out of theological claims, so I'm not going to try to get mileage out of concepts that find the happiest homes within theological moral systems or moral frameworks. So I'm probably going to do a bad job of locating what I mean by intrinsic value in light of other theories that have been advanced of that ilk. All I mean by it is a value separate from whether or not humans value it in the subjective sense.
Okay, well, I guess we had a lot from you this morning. I'd like to thank you very much for this wonderful conversation, for the extreme generosity, and for the absolute richness of your thought, and for this wonderful debate. Thank you very much, Professor Heidi.
Thank you. I now have to go write a book on the basis of all of your comments. So, thank you.